People without morals and honor can be a big problem even in everyday life. However, the protagonists of today's story went even further as they held significant power in their hands. We tell you how far ruthlessness and power given to unworthy individuals can take them. Donald was born on October 12, 1943, in New York, USA. He was a sporty, prominent man in his youth, the quarterback of his school football team, and the most popular boy in high school. After graduating from Princeton, Jeffrey studied medicine and completed an internship at a renowned medical center in New York City. He married Colette Stevenson, his high school sweetheart, and shortly after the wedding, their daughter Kimberly was born, who was 5 years old at the time of the events in question. 3 years later, Kristen was born into the family. After receiving training, the young man joined the Army and was later admitted to the famous Green Berets. Over the next 2 years, Jeff was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Their life, previously characterized by moves, eventually stabilized. They settled in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and lived in a house assigned to them by the state. Her husband came home from work at 1 p.m., took no more business trips, and Colette finally calmed down. The woman hoped that her husband would end his service in a few years, and then they would have their own house on a farm far from the hustle and bustle of the city. At the time of the tragedy, Colette was pregnant with their third child. It seemed like the perfect story, but it was about to turn into one of the cruelest crimes in the history of the United States of America. At 3:30 a.m. on February 17, 1977, the Fayetteville Emergency Center received a call from a man posing as Captain McDonald. He informed the duty operator that there had been a brutal attack at his house. According to the man, his wife had been stabbed and possibly raped, and he could not say what had happened to his children. He asked for immediate help. The dispatcher immediately sent several police cars to the address, but could not send an ambulance until it was determined whether the victims needed one. On the way to the house, the police officers noticed a strange woman standing in the rain at 3:55 a.m. wearing a wide-brimmed hat. She did nothing but stand still as if waiting for something. However, the police officers had no time to be distracted by her and drove past her. Just a few minutes later, several military police officers arrived at the McDonald family's house. They were needed because one of the victims was a military member. The lights in the house were off, forcing the officers to enter through the back door. In the first room, they found 26-year-old Colette lifeless on the floor. The woman was blood-soaked, and judging by her body position, she might have been raped. Her face was severely disfigured, and her clothes were torn. She lay on her back, and next to her, crouching on the floor, lay her injured husband. As the first officer approached, Jeffrey immediately asked to check on his children because he heard their screams but could not reach them. One of the police officers searched the other rooms and first found 5-year-old Kimberly in the nursery. She had suffered several severe injuries that cost her her life. In another room, 2-year-old Kristen lay on a bed with a large number of similar injuries and also showed no signs of life. Jeffrey was severely injured. He had stab wounds to the head and upper chest area. At some point, he lost consciousness, but a police officer revived him to find out what had happened. Heavily breathing, the man reported that 3 men and a woman had broken into his house, probably hippies. One of the strangers was black-skinned and wore a jacket with sergeant stripes. The woman he described looked exactly like the suspicious woman with the hat that the police had seen on the way to the house. Unfortunately, she was never found that night. An ambulance took Jeffrey away. He was the only member of the family to survive the night. All others tragically died. Jeffrey received first aid and was treated for his wounds, including a severe lung injury. The man was also sedated. Afterwards, the police officers could talk to the victim of the attack. According to his account, he and his wife had drunk a glass of orange liqueur that evening. He had to lie down on the sofa in the living room because his daughter had wet the bed next to him. He fell asleep in front of the TV, but suddenly woke up with severe pain. He was attacked without warning by 3 unknown men. The fourth person was a woman with a hat who just stood nearby, watching with a torch or candle in hand. To him, it looked like they were hippies under the influence of illegal substances. The woman gave orders, telling the men to kill the pigs. He could no longer see their faces because his eyes were smeared with blood. Jeffrey lost consciousness, and when he came to, he found his wife lifeless. He tried to give her first aid, but nothing worked. Jeffrey wanted to go to his children and try to help them, but he could not do so because of his injuries. Thus, he called the 911 emergency number. The Army's Criminal Investigation Department sent the least experienced investigator on duty to the crime scene. After examining the house, he concluded that the military survivor's story was fabricated. The 27-year-old Jeffrey's story with the hippies seemed implausible to the officer. He found no evidence of the presence of outsiders. After this decision by the investigator, all efforts of the investigation focused on proving Jeffrey's guilt. The father of the McDonald family was arrested, and the soldier was charged with triple premeditated murder. The trial turned into a disaster, which was clear from the start. The soldier's defense tried to find out how professionally the arriving military police had inspected the house. In cross-examination, it turned out that numerous irregularities had been committed, and the actions taken could have severely damaged the evidence and the crime scene. Indeed, the site was simply trampled, and it was very difficult to find traces of the perpetrators there. This allowed the defense to insist that all the prosecution's conclusions about Jeffrey's involvement in the crime were wrong, and that the murderers were hippie outsiders. Jeffrey was a decent family man, a loving father and husband, and a professional in his field. Thus, he found many supporters, even at his workplace, who supported him and did not believe the man was guilty. The military member had no single motive or reason for the murder, and no one believed he could have injured himself so severely to stage a murder while he was in the crosshairs of death. Even Colette's stepfather, named Freddie KB, was so outraged that he launched an official campaign nationwide to prove Jeffrey's innocence. At the same time, an article appeared condemning the military justice for keeping the hearings closed to the public and the media. However, this did not help in any way, and the conduct of the trial remained behind the scenes, where more and more evidence of the investigators' incompetence was presented. Indeed, the investigation was conducted very negligently. The ambulance driver moved things in the house and even managed to steal the suspect's wallet right in front of the arriving police officers. The main perpetrator damaged some evidence during the transport of the bodies. No fingerprints or hair samples were taken from the victims to compare them with other evidence at the crime scene. The fingerprints on Kristen's phone, the baby bottle, and other items were completely eliminated. Practically everyone involved in the investigation was new and behaved unprofessionally. The list of uncovered irregularities grew longer with every minute of questioning the investigation participants. Coincidentally, the investigators received a clue about the young woman they met in the rain on the street, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Her name was Helena Stockley. It turned out that she was the daughter of a retired Army officer with an unenviable criminal record and a connection to the underworld. Helena turned out to be a police informant, but she also became a real activist of the hippie culture and was involved in the sale of illegal substances for many years. The police officers spoke with Helena and learned many valuable pieces of information about her environment. Unfortunately, serious irregularities also occurred during the interrogation, especially since the investigator did not turn on the recording of the conversation so that it could be shown to the judge during the trial. During the hearing, the inexperienced investigator claimed that the investigations into Helena's involvement were not yet complete. However, the situation escalated to the point that the investigators simply did not know where she was. She had run away. As everyone became aware of the full extent of the incompetence of the Army investigation, it seemed necessary to start the investigation anew in every respect. Nevertheless, the military leadership kept the hearing secret from the media. One of the police officers, however, decided to inform the journalists about the inadequacies of the military commission. This led to even more anger, which the military leadership took out on Jeffrey, who was trying to prove their case. Everyone around him was convinced of his innocence, except for the military commission, which refused to acknowledge his incompetence. Unfortunately, the military had much power in their hands, and they did not want to give in. They believed that Jeffrey, although there was no strong motive for the crime, might have taken substances that could trigger aggression and lead to a murder. Contrary to the prosecution, witnesses testified that Jeffrey was a reliable husband and a loving father. These defense witness statements were overwhelming. Moreover, the man was in a completely weak state at the time of the massacre. Only a small concentration of alcohol was detected in his blood, which could not significantly influence Jeffrey's behavior and lead him to commit crazy acts. Among the witnesses were not only friends and family members who wanted to support the man, but also real experts, c.g., psychiatrists. They conducted an examination and claimed that Jeffrey did not possess traits that could lead to such a murder of family members. Even the civil police were convinced of Jeffrey's innocence, as there was a lack of evidence and a motive. His mother had to sell her house to pay the lawyers. This time, the charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence, which did not prevent the military commission from investigating again later. The military police even swore that they would continue their campaign to convict Captain MacDonald at any cost. In their opinion, the mistakes in their work were not so serious and had no significant impact on the outcome. They believed that Jeffrey was the guilty party. At the same time, Jeffrey submitted a dismissal report because he was completely disillusioned with the U.S. Army. Jeffrey began his campaign to expose the armed forces through the media. Unfortunately, he had no idea how powerful his enemies really were and how much danger he was putting himself in. At this point, Helena Stockley was discovered by the police. She told several people that she might have actually witnessed the murder of the MacDonald family committed by her friends. The woman was ready to testify in court and tried to obtain immunity. Her statements were tested with a lie detector and proved to be true. Nevertheless, the military leadership wanted to hear nothing about the other suspects, but focused entirely on Jeffrey and prepared a new indictment against him. In the summer of 1971, Jeffrey and his friend traveled to Long Beach in California, where he wanted to start his life anew without suspecting that a conspiracy was brewing against him. They took a job in the emergency room of a medical center. Thanks to their dedication, the department became the best in the entire facility. Jeffrey's professional qualities were highly valued and were reflected, among other things, in the publications of medical journals. Jeffrey also became an activist against child abuse. Unfortunately, the military police remembered all the time that he had escaped an undeserved punishment and exposed the armed forces. In 1974, a new theory about Jeffrey was put forward. The military prosecutor's office gained insight into his psychiatric reports. The prosecutor's office received them only under the condition that Dr. MacDonald appear in court simultaneously with the disclosure of the contents of the documents. Of course, the prosecutor's office did not adhere to its part of the agreement as part of the impending conspiracy. Jeff had to undergo a truth serum test, which was illegal. No charges were filed without waiting for an answer from Jeffrey. He was indicted again, and the trial was set for mid-1979. A campaign was launched to tarnish his name. It was a high-profile case, and from the beginning, everything was against MacDonald. But the defense campaign at that time had no idea, and people from the highest ranks of the government rallied against the former captain of the armed forces. Deputy U.S. Attorney James Blackburn wanted to use the case as a stepping stone for his career. Later, he was found guilty of forgery, fraud, and embezzlement. But when the triple murder case was retried, his reputation was still untarnished. The deputy prosecutor took the cover-up to a whole new level. He had evidence proving the defendant's innocence, but of course, it was in his interest not to let it reach the defense team. As a result, all this evidence was hidden from the defense lawyers, who were not even allowed to examine the collected evidence themselves or familiarize themselves with the file. All this was achieved only with the help of the judge, who was clearly on the side of the prosecution. Any evidence of the defendant's innocence was either not admitted in front of the jury or strictly withheld from Jeffrey's lawyers. For example, new Heller fibers resembling a hair were found in Collett's hand. According to the prosecution, it was a tuft plucked from the head of the daughter's doll. In reality, they belonged to Helena Stockley, as she wore a blonde wig that night, which she took off immediately after the massacre. Jeffrey's hairs were also found in Collett's hand, but since he lived there and revived her, the presence of the hairs in her hand is understandable and could be a coincidence that does not indicate his guilt. Skin particles were found under her fingernails, which definitely did not come from Jeffrey and were identified as traces of the perpetrators. However, they were never analyzed and later found to be missing. All this was diligently ignored during the trial, as well as dozens of other evidence of Jeffrey's innocence. One of the most important accusations on which the prosecution based its judgment was the pajama fibers found on the ice pick. According to the prosecution, this tool was used to kill Collett and the children. They said that the ice pick left several pieces of fabric from the clothes the officers found Jeffrey in on the night of the triple murder. Years later, it turned out that these claims were false. In fact, several black fibers were found on the ice pick that matched those on Collett's body, but did not match any of the clothing pieces in the MacDonald house. The prosecution formulated this information so that the widow could be considered the perpetrator. Candle wax droplets were found at the scene of the massacre that did not match any of the 14 candles found in the victim's house. However, they were identical to those used by Helena Stockley in her rituals. The woman considered herself a witch and practiced witchcraft. Jeffrey saw the candle she held in her hand on the night of the attack, but his face was blood-smeared, and he could not see well because of his injuries, so he could not say with certainty whether Helena was holding a lantern or a candle. Even the ice pick itself, which was the murder weapon, raised many questions. Until the year 79, the main witnesses in this case, namely a relative of the victim and the family's nanny, claimed that there was no such tool in the MacDonald house. After long talks with the prosecution, however, they suddenly changed their statement. Also, the blood on Jeffrey's pajamas raised questions. The prosecution's expert argued that the arrangement of the stains indicated that it was the spouse who had fought with Collett. However, after documents about the trial were published, it turned out that this was also a lie. In court, an experiment was even conducted with a mannequin into which metal rods were inserted, whose positions matched Collett's wounds. MacDonald's pajamas were held against these rods, and it turned out that some of the stains matched in their position, but not all. The prosecution considered this to be clear evidence of the man's guilt, but the defender was able to prove that most of the stains did not match. Nevertheless, the experiment became one of the strongest pieces of evidence of the defendant's guilt. Another strong claim of the prosecution was the story that fibers from her husband's pajamas were found in Ket's hair. However, this later turned out to be untrue because the defense knew nothing about it before the hearing, and Jeffy's lawyer could not refute the claims in time. Another false statement was the information about blue footprints found on the couple's bedding. The prosecution believed they showed how the husband had dragged his wife's body. Later, it turned out that none of the described bloody footprints existed. Also, the prosecution was not aware of certain information at the time of the trial, especially that Helena Stockley had turned to the FBI in the 78s and reported that she had been involved in a triple murder. During that time, she was being treated in a hospital for depression and suicidal thoughts. At the trial, the woman said that on the day of the massacre, she was with her friend Greg Mitchell and some soldiers from Fort Bragg. They had all consumed something and, as she said, lost control. Helena said she called the MacDonald's house late at night to make sure all family members were present. She could not remember the further events. Unfortunately, the military police also came to her, and the woman was so intimidated that at her second trial, Helena could not say what she had done between midnight and 5 a.m. However, She admitted to owning such a hat and a blonde wig, which were later burned because they could be used as evidence against her. Witnesses at the trial testified that Helena was present during the massacre. She stood with a candle and whispered some nonsensical incantations, but did not kill any member of the MacDonald family herself. When her friends came to the children, she became weak and fled the house. It was speculated that the murder was committed for a specific reason. Helena's friends actually had a motive: revenge. The soldiers wanted to punish Dr. Jeffrey for banning them from taking substances, controlling the tests, and not issuing prescriptions for prohibited medications. These were soldiers who had returned from Vietnam and were addicted. Naturally, all this information was carefully hidden from Jeffrey's defenders. Helena Stockley was interrogated 3 times successfully, and her statement was confirmed. Nevertheless, her statement was classified as unreliable. The judge imposed restrictions on the disclosure of information about the woman and her accomplices, which was one of the obstacles for Jeffrey's defenders. The defense relied on the psychological profile and the innocence of the accused to convince the jury of his inability to commit a murder. The judge allowed the use of previously collected data, but only if Jeffrey underwent further examination by a psychiatrist of the prosecution. This was, of course, a trap. As it turned out, this specialist had worked with the military prosecutor's office throughout the 8-year investigation, which wanted to put Jeffrey behind bars forever. Indeed, after a brief interrogation, the doctor concluded that he was dealing with a murderous psychopath. Ultimately, the court did not allow the use of a psychological profile of Jeffrey previously created by another psychiatrist, which could have rehabilitated him in the eyes of the experts. Nevertheless, the new report was presented, which had devastating consequences for the defense. The prosecution managed to replace the beautiful image of Jeffrey with that of a real monster, and the judge, with these findings, betrayed the inviolability of the law. Naturally, the jury found Jeffrey guilty of the murder of his wife and 2 children, sentencing him to 3 life sentences. Surprisingly, however, the revenge of the leadership of the military police was not yet over. After it became known that the soldiers from Fort Bragg actually had serious problems with illegal substances, many who returned from Vietnam turned out to be addicted. The leadership of the unit was not prepared to deal with such problems. All this coincided with the emergence of the hippie movement, which actively developed in the 60s and 70s and worsened even more. Jeffrey was against prohibition and tried in every possible way to make it difficult for the soldiers to access substances, which caused outrage. Later, a group of people came together who wanted to pay Jeffrey a deadly visit. Helena's guilt could really not be doubted. Even her husband, whom she had married in the 80s, testified to her involvement. Her husband believed that Helena had not killed anyone, but was certainly a witness or even an accomplice to the crime. She told many details from the crime scene that had not yet been published, and that she could only have known because she was in the MacDonald house that fateful night. Helena was interrogated 3 times, and her story that she was in the house was confirmed. Her statement was later recorded on video, where she said that the perpetrators forced Jeffrey to issue a prescription for medications when they entered the MacDonald house, but he stubbornly refused, which led to a fight in which family members were killed, and he survived as a martyr. The perpetrators wrote "Death to all pigs" on the wall, probably wanting to emulate Charles Manson, who was very popular at that time. Helena died at the age of 30 from complications of a liver disease in '82. Her statement on camera could, however, be used in court with the judge's permission. Helena's friend Greg Mitchell was a 19-year-old soldier at the time of the triple murder who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, which caused him great distress. He had recently returned from Vietnam and was one of the few who wanted to return to the war to endure the horrors he had experienced. He began actively using illegal substances and was sent back to Vietnam after being discharged in '71 for his addiction. He confessed to a friend that he had been involved in the murder of his family. There were also several eyewitnesses to his prayers as he murdered numerous children. Numerous pieces of evidence were also found linking him to the crime scene. including his blood and hair. He was left-handed, and an independent expert believed that the stab wounds were inflicted with a left hand. However, he met a fate similar to Helenus. He died at the age of 32, also from liver problems, and could no longer testify in court. One of the biggest mistakes of Jeffrey MacDonald was his friend with the writer Joe McGinn. They met shortly before the reopening of the proceedings, and Jeffrey suggested writing a book about the case. According to the defendant, this could be a trump card in his sleeve for the upcoming hearings. Jeffrey let Joe in on all the details of the trial and allowed him to attend all the sessions. In return, he received part of the publisher's advance for the book and waived any claims against the author for the purpose of the book. The friendship between the two men grew closer. The writer lived with him, and they ate, drank, and played together. For 3 years, Joe supported Jeffrey and encouraged him to continue defending the doctor's innocence. Finally, Joe betrayed him and described him in the book as a real monster. From private conversations, the author of the book learned that Jeffrey had taken diet pills shortly before the triple murder, a then quite strong substance. It was a one-time intake, but the author described it as if Jeffrey had taken the medication 3 times a day, which could have led to a severe overdose. According to the author, this was the reason for his anger and his retaliations against family members. Joe also found an excuse. It was known that his daughter had wet his side of the bed. Of course, a father in a normal family would not get angry about this, but Joe described this event as the reason why the supposedly loving family father snapped. According to Joe, in connection with the effects of the medications, Jeffrey developed a psychosis and killed the entire family. Even though Jeffrey's blood was tested on the day of the triple murder, the toxicological test revealed no other chemical substances besides a minimal amount of alcohol from the liquor. Joe claimed he had changed his mind about Jeffrey's guilt during the trial. In fact, it was a financially better decision for him. The controversial book was distributed in thousands of copies, enjoyed great popularity, and brought the author millions, and the distorted facts described in it severely damaged Jeffrey's reputation. From that moment on, the number of people who believed in his innocence significantly decreased. Fortunately, Jeffrey was able to sue the author of the book for defamation, as many of the facts were indeed strongly distorted. In August '84, a lawsuit was filed, demanding several $million in compensation from the author. After several hearings, Jeffrey finally agreed to a much lower sum of $325,000. Most of the compensation was deposited into a trust fund, but Jeffrey retained the right to continue his fight for justice against the writer. Jeffrey's story touches many. Several prominent lawyers who believed in him and wanted to help work pro bono to exonerate him. Nevertheless, one appeal after another was rejected. In '90, new reasons for a reopening of the proceedings and a review of the court decision emerged. Many pieces of evidence of Jeffrey's non-involvement in the triple murder were uncovered, including the results of forensic examinations. Unfortunately, the trial was again led by the same judge who continued to corner the defenders, as he was never impartial in this case. Ultimately, the case was advanced only in '97 when the defenders could prove that much of the information from witnesses and the prosecution was false. The big breakthrough during this time was the advent of new technologies for DNA tests, and Jeffrey's defense team was able to conduct tests. Unfortunately, the judge constantly hindered the defenders from achieving justice even in this phase. Finally, information about Helena Stokely came to light. A video of her testimony was made available to the defenders. At this point, the wrongfully convicted Jeffrey had already spent 2 decades in prison, but he did not stop fighting. The military prosecutor's office continued to relentlessly deny all new facts. New witnesses were found who were intimidated or otherwise swayed to the side of the prosecution. One of them stated that he had heard how Helena Stokely confessed her presence in the MacDonald's house during the murders to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor had threatened her with prosecution if she testified as a witness for the defense. Thus, he forced her to remain silent. Eventually, Prosecutor Blackburn was involved in a series of crimes, including forgery, theft, and embezzlement, and he was imprisoned. In January 2006, new evidence and the possibility of a new trial emerged. First, a video of Helena Stockley's confession was released, and then evidence supporting her words based on DNA tests became publicly available. Hair and tissue found on the victims' bodies were analyzed and found to come from unknown individuals. In March 2006, another important episode occurred in the case. A man reported to the police that he had drunk several times in a bar with a man who confessed to having been involved in the massacre of the MacDonald family. This happened between the 80s and 82. The drinking partner of the new witness turned out to be Gregory Mitchell, Helena's friend. The last time he heard details of the crime was 14 days before Greg's death. The cashier of the 7-Eleven store near Jeffrey's house claimed he had seen a group of hippies enter the store the morning after the murder. They looked unkempt, were blood-stained, and talked about the crime they had committed. However, he kept silent about the conversation because he was afraid for his life at the time. He was threatened. He recognized Greg and Helena in the group. An employee of the rehabilitation center where Greg Mitchell was treated also testified that he had repeatedly confessed to her the murder of Jeffrey's wife and his children, and had also written confessions on the walls of the center. However, all this evidence was ignored by the court. 54 years have passed since the brutal massacre of an innocent woman and 2 children. Jeffrey's defenders are still clinging to the possibility of proving his innocence by filing an appeal. The last time the man tried to appeal against his sentence was in 2021, but the appeal was denied. Jeffrey's life continues behind prison bars. He still does not give up and sincerely hopes that he will still have the opportunity to breathe the air of freedom. While he was behind bars, he met one of the innocence activists, Catherine Currid. A relationship developed between them. The woman visited him, and they became so close that they got married. Catherine runs a website for Jeffrey's case and is committed with all her might to the man's release. The 80-year-old Jeffrey, who has spent most of his life behind bars, claims that the real perpetrators have gone unpunished. They have already lived their lives. Some are dead and have not had to answer for their atrocities. Thank you for watching, and take care.